So let's say that all of your application materials are ready. Your personal statement feels polished, it's been read by multiple people, and you're really happy with the way that it's worked out. Let's say your LSAT score is also where you want it to be, and your GPA is as good as it's going to get. So, what are some considerations you would want to have before you start applying? In this video, I'm going to be going over those considerations. The first thing I want to talk to you about is something that I call triangulation. This is a first order consideration that you want to have before you start applying. Here's a little model of how I think you should think about this. There are really three things you want to consider when applying to law school, and hopefully you've thought about each of these three things earlier in the process rather than on the eve of actually applying for law schools. But if you haven't, now is really the time to do so. The three things that I think you need to consider when you're applying to law school are cost, your job prospects, and the ranking of the school that you're looking at. Those three pieces are going to spell out the success that you're going to have long term. Oftentimes, the things that you learn in law school are going to prepare you to be a great lawyer no matter what school you go to. But these three things can have a drastic bearing on how successful you're going to be in the rest of your career. Hopefully, these three things are balanced, kind of like an equilateral triangle. Ideally, you want to have these things generally about the same. So, for example, you want your cost to be affordable. You want it to be something that you can not take out a lot of debt for. A lot of students that go to law school assume that, well, I'm going to take out large amounts of debt and then I can pay that debt off in the years to follow. Hopefully I'll get a high-paying job. I can use a significant portion of that disposable income to pay for interest on my loans, and maybe that debt will go away really quickly. As you saw when I was talking about the job prospects of a lot of students that are leaving law school, the reality is that most lawyers make somewhere in a nice middle class salary, right around $60,000 or $70,000 a year. That's a comfortable living if you don't have a lot of debt, but if you take out six-figure loans, as many law students do, that could spell your doom. You'll be paying those off for 10, 15, 20 years. And you also can't necessarily rely on public loan forgiveness to be able to help that out. That's oftentimes a political consideration, and many times Congress monkeys with those processes, so it's not a guarantee that you're always going to be able to have those loans forgiven. So it's really a good idea right now to be thinking about how you're going to pay for law school. Are you going to pay for it out of pocket? That's a pretty steep goal, given that many law schools charge around $20,000 to $30,000 a semester. But maybe you have some deep pockets and can do that. Maybe you have family members that can subsidize your education. Another thing that you really want to look at, and that most people try to consider, are scholarships. Law schools really want to try to get the very best and brightest. And remember, when I talked about your GPA and your LSAT score, law schools assume that the LSAT score is some kind of a proxy for being a great student. So if you've got a high LSAT score and a high GPA and you look pretty favorable and you have some promise, law schools will probably pay you to go there. And what you'll notice is that cost is oftentimes associated with rank. Now, what I mean by rank is usually the U.S. News and World Report. If you're going to want to figure out what the ranking of a law school is, that's where you really want to go. The U.S. News and World Report lists all of the 400 some odd or 200 some odd law schools. It's growing all the time in the nation, and it ranks them according to their ability to place people. The law schools are trying to kind of take in a lot of different pieces and as to how they're going to place their law students, and the U.S. News and World Report is measuring that in some way. The U.S. News and World Report is based on a survey that is sent out annually to practitioners, to judges, to law professors, to people that are associated with the legal industry. And it basically asks, what are the best schools? And in reality, a lot of the same schools continue to be the best. There's what's called the top 14, which are the same law schools that have been in the top 10 at least once and are oftentimes associated with the top 10. Those 14 schools circle back and forth. They're always changing positions, and occasionally a law school will break into that group. But that top 14 is the one that you're basically gunning for. That's the golden ticket. And costs that are associated with those are very high because a law degree from one of those schools means that you can practice just about anywhere, and a lot of doors are going to open. Then there's what I would call kind of the top 25 to top 30 law schools. And these are still pretty internationally recognized. They're recognized as good programs without necessarily being the ones that are at the very top. Then there's certain other quartiles. There's the top 50, the top 100, and then the top 200 or so schools. Those are schools that once you get further and further down the ranking are pretty powerful regional schools, especially if you're in the top 50. And that means that employers in the area of those law schools or in the surrounding states will recognize that school as a high quality school, and it will lead to a lot of job prospects for you. The further you go down that ranking, though, the more and more likely you are to struggle to find employment. That doesn't mean that you're completely foreclosed, not at all. It just means that you're going to have to get creative, and you're going to have to prove yourself in law school. If you're the top of the class in, say, a top 100 school, and your school is ranked 105, well, then being the top of the class is going to mean a lot of possibilities for you. But if you're an average student coming from one of those schools, you might be limited in the kinds of things that you can do. Now, you may be totally okay with that, and that's where your job prospects come in. Maybe you have connections already to a law firm. Maybe you have family members who run a legal practice and you want to take over that business in the short term. Or maybe you already have some connections to government. Maybe you've interned and you feel pretty confident that that networking is going to open up some doors for you. Or maybe in the first year of law school, you make connections with some professors, especially those adjunct professors who are practitioners. That was a thing that worked out really well for me in my first year of law school. I made connections to the person that was my adjunct in my legal research and writing course, and it worked out really well for me. I was able to make really great connections to that firm, got a first year internship there, and then managed to get a summer associateship there in the second year summer. So a lot of those things can kind of work favorably for you. The key with this triangulation, though, is you want to try to balance things out. And the reason why I want to emphasize the balancing piece is that oftentimes nothing is perfect. You're not going to be able to perfectly balance these things. So what I've done here is I've shown you how that equilateral triangle can sometimes shift based on some challenges that you might encounter. You'll notice that each of these triangles has a pretty steep peak in some way. And that steep peak represents the fact that maybe each of those pieces is working against you. So for instance, this particular law school might be very, very costly to go to. You're going to have to take out a lot of debt. You're not going to be able to pay it off quickly. It's a very expensive place to live, so you're going to have to take out some loans for your cost of living. And since you can't work in that first year of law school, that means that you're not going to have a lot of disposable income to be able to meet your needs throughout the year. So if it's a high cost program, that's what's driving the triangle to shift that way. Or maybe your job prospects are really low. Maybe going into law school, you know that you have no connections to law, and you don't feel really confident that you know where you're going to work before you even begin. That's where a lot of law students are. In fact, you're probably most likely in this boat. You want to be a lawyer, but you don't really have many connections to it. So I'm going to circle back to that triangle in just a second. And then maybe the ranking is really, really low. Maybe the law school that you managed to get into is in the middling or even the low end of some of the rankings, which means that it's not going to have the prestige that will open up doors for you. In each of those cases, the peak is working against you in some way. So if that's the case, then based on triangulation, you want to be able to make those other 2 points work for you. So as the peak gets steeper, those two things come closer and closer together so that you're managing them in your best possible way. So in other words, as the cost goes up, you want to make sure that your job and the ranking are working in favor of you. If something is negative, you want these 2 things to be a positive. And the same is true for these other 2 triangles. So if the cost is really high at your law school, then you want to be sure that you have really good possibilities of a job prospect. In other words, you want a good network for you, and you want to make sure that your ranking is working for you. If your ranking is really high, then maybe you can internalize some of those costs because you'll be more likely to get a job. In other words, you want this thing to be balanced out by two really important pieces. Same is true with ranking. If your ranking for your law school is very, very low, then you want to make sure that you have some connections to the job market. You've done some good networking, you know people, you can make connections, and you want your costs to be very, very low. You want a scholarship, basically. You want to, as much as possible, not have to pay for that law degree, because that law degree is not going to be as marketable as, say, a top 10 law degree. In other words, you want that possibility that maybe you're going to take a low-paying job so that you won't have to incur a whole lot of debt that you're going to have to pay for on a low salary. And the key with this one is that many, many law students are right here. Chances are you probably have no idea what you want to actually do someday. Most law students go into law school not having those connections. So in that case, the two most important things you need to be thinking about is how are you going to pay for this if you don't know what you're going to do someday, and how well is your ranking working for you. The higher the ranking, the more likely you'll get the job that you want to. The lower the ranking, quite possibly no. So the key is two things have to balance a negative. If you don't have those two things, it's going to be much harder. So let me give you an example. If your costs are really high and you don't have very good prospects with a job, well then ranking may not totally save you. Just going to the best school is not going to mean totally a golden ticket. Just because you go to Harvard doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have great job prospects and that it's going to be affordable for you to go to law school. So just having one of those pieces is not enough. You've got to have both, or at least they have to be closely aligned in some way. So take the average law student. If you know that your job prospects are low and the cost is going to be very high, then your ranking again is probably not going to save you. The key and the big point I'm trying to emphasize here is you want to make sure that you're trying to do this as affordably as possible. The model of going in and taking out a lot of debt to go to law school is a recipe for a lot of risk. What it means is that you're going to be deferring a lot of income for the next couple of decades that otherwise could be money in the bank for you. And it could be basically a lot of a risky venture because you don't know if your job's going to be there for those 2 decades. If you know that your law degree is coming from a low-ranked school and you have very, very high debt, well, there's a very real possibility that your salary will not be enough to cover that six figures worth of loans. And there's the possibility you could lose your job in those 2 decades. So what should you do? Well, you should aim for schools where you can get good scholarships, and you should aim for the best school that you can at the most affordable price. You don't necessarily want to shoot for the top and then take out tons of debt. Now, if you get into Yale or if you get into Harvard, maybe you should probably just go. There's a good argument to be made for that. But if you get into a place like George Washington University, or you get into a place like Georgetown in very, very costly cities, or you go to NYU, which is a very costly place to go, or UCLA, which is a costly place to go, those are middling schools. They're in the top 25. They're not totally the best schools in the world, but they're decent. But if you're taking out six-figure loans and they're not paying any amount of money for you to go there, well, then you might run a serious risk that you're going to be fighting with a lot of people for a very narrow amount of jobs that can help pay for those loans. So maybe it might be worthwhile to go to a top 50 school that's going to offer you scholarships. That's usually what happens, by the way, based on all of these rankings and based on your LSAT score being what it is based on the median LSAT for previously admitted students. If you get an LSAT score that's going to get you on a wait list at a top 25 school and that will get you admitted in a top 50 school, that LSAT score might give you a scholarship in a top 100 school. So in other words, try to find that place where it's going to be most affordable, but most likely to lead to job prospects. And think about that triangulation model. The key is really to emphasize those two things to offset a negative. Another thing that you want to consider is that you want to apply often. So you want to apply to as many law schools as you possibly can. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about ways that you can reduce costs for that. The reason why you want to take that shotgun approach is because law schools are looking at lots of different people all at once. If you apply to many, many law schools, you have a higher chance of getting in, and you have a higher chance of getting scholarships. And based on what I said about triangulation, you want to aim for many different possibilities in terms of law schools. You can apply for those reach schools, the ones that would be your dream place that maybe you don't have a very good chance of getting in, but maybe you're on that 25 percentile line. Maybe your GPA falls on the other side of the curve. There's no problem with applying for those reach schools. It might work out for you. There's also what you would call your middling schools, the average, the one that you're most likely to get into. These are the ones that are kind of in the middle of the pack based on your LSAT score and GPA, and you want to apply to a lot of those schools. And then maybe you pick 3 or 4 safety schools, the one you know for sure you're going to get into. Maybe your LSAT score and GPA are at their highest. You're in the top 75 percentile of people that have been admitted to that school. Again, you should use some of the things that I talked about in identifying good law schools and going through that application process based on your LSAT score. If you haven't looked at my LSAT video, then you should go back and do that, because that'll give you a good way of measuring your likelihood of success in the application process. Now, you should also apply early. So in addition to applying to many schools, you should apply as often or as early as possible. Law schools in most parts of the country use what's called a rolling admission. So many schools will look at your admission scores or at your application materials in the fall, and then there will be a point in about December or January when they will start admitting people, and they will continue to admit people all the way until the summer. So in other words, you have every incentive to apply earlier in that process so that your application materials are in, and so when the first cut of people that are being admitted happens, you're most likely to be right there. So get your application materials ready during the summer before you apply. Once those applications open up in September or late August or early October, you want all of your materials to be ready. You don't want to have to be working last minute. You want to already know what schools you're going to apply to. Basically, you've spent that summer between whenever it is you finished undergrad or whatever work you've been doing, and then before you start applying. That summertime period is an opportunity to really start targeting where you plan to go and how you plan to go about doing it. Make sure that you're also looking into things like early decision. Some schools, for instance, will give you the opportunity to choose that your application will be read much earlier in the process. So some schools will give you the chance to be admitted even sometimes as early as October or November. That early decision possibility is kind of like a gamble. It's basically saying, I think I stand a decent chance of getting in, but by basically telling the law school that you were willing to take that early decision, it means you're willing to sacrifice admission at other schools, and you're going to be locked in on that acceptance. It sends a message to the schools. It says, I really want to go here. Now, of course, the downside is that if you get admitted into those early decision programs, some of them lock you in. You basically have to give your seat deposit and you are admitted, and they assume that you're coming there. And barring any other foreseeable circumstances, you probably are going to have to pay a lot of money to essentially lock your seat in. So you want to be able to decide, is this actually a thing I want to do? If you know for sure you want to go to that law school, well, maybe the early decision program works out for you. I wouldn't suggest that you apply to every early decision program. What you probably want to do is pick the 1 or 2 and then see what happens. As I say, it's a high risk situation. The other thing you want to do is also to apply correctly. You want to make sure that you're looking at all of the application details. The nice thing about letters of recommendation is that they come through the Law School Admissions Council. They are fed through one main system, and then the Law School Admissions Council sends those out individually. And most schools also follow a similar system in which you fill out an application, you upload a personal statement, and then you upload your resume, and your LSAT score is automatically sent to that school. So most applications follow a similar process. But occasionally there are applications that will require you to include certain things, like maybe they give you the option to include short addenda about your background. I talked a little bit about that in your personal statement. Maybe there's some addenda that you can include about poor scores that you got in the early part of your undergrad. There may also be some required things that are in the application, such as a statement about your character, or maybe there's a statement about why you really want to go to that law school. These are usually short statements, but they might be required. You want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence. Look at each of the applications carefully, follow the instructions, and don't just assume that every application is going to look identical. So many times students will sometimes be in a really great position to get into a law school, but their application just wasn't correct, in which case that might be a really big red flag to the admissions committee and lead to you not getting in. You also want to reduce the cost of your application process, and this is not necessarily the same as reducing your tuition costs. And what I mean by that is you want to look for opportunities to reduce your fees. It costs money to apply for law schools. Some of those costs can be fairly high. They can range between $50 and $100, and that can be very costly if you're applying to a lot of schools. After all, if you apply to, say, 30 schools and you're paying on average $100, that's $3,000 that you're going to just have to give up as part of the application process. So I highly recommend that you check out fee waivers. This is the LSAC fee waiver. This is the Law School Admissions Council one. And what it does is it basically frees up you to be able to take 2 LSATs at a reduced cost or free. It also gives you an opportunity to access some law school reports that would normally be costly. And it does a few other things strictly for the LSAC. But the other great thing that it does is if you're approved for this fee waiver, well, then most law schools will just waive your fees for their application. So you don't even have to pay for that application that you're sending in. Well, that's going to save you a ton of money. When I was applying to law school, I took advantage of this. I was a poor college student. I was recently married, and so my tax dollars were extremely low. I was basically at the poverty level. So I used that to my advantage. I applied for this fee waiver. I got it. I took 2 LSATs for free, and I applied to 30 law schools without having to pay a single dime for it. That's really great. That's a really great process, and it made it really worthwhile so that I had a ton of options when the admissions decisions started coming in. You should probably do the same thing. There's certain requirements that you have to meet, and those involve things like your citizenship status, or at least your registration with the DACA program. You also have to show some level of need. It's a need-based fee waiver. You have to prove that your income is at a certain threshold, and usually that means that you have to be independent of your parents in some way if they're making a lot of money. So you want to be able to essentially send the message to LSAC that you're standing on your own 2 feet and you're not very wealthy. You're basically making the case that you can't really afford to apply to these law schools, but you otherwise would really love to be able to do so. And you're proving to LSAC that you need some need. Individual law schools will also have a fee waiver, and you can apply for those as well, and they may be a little bit easier to get. The downside, of course, to that, and the upside to the LSAC system, is that it's really one fee application process, or fee waiver application process, and it's useful for multiple schools. The fee waivers for individual schools really only apply to those schools. So if you get a fee waiver at one school that you manage to apply for, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a fee waiver at other schools unless you get this LSAC one. So I highly recommend that you look into that. You might also look into some other means. For instance, if you got family members that are willing to foot the bill for you, or if you got some grant money that you can tie into. Basically, you want to be saving up in some way for your application process, especially if you're planning to apply to a lot of schools. And then last of all, you want to manage your wait lists wisely. Now, hopefully you won't have any wait lists. Hopefully you'll be able to either be admitted or you'll have a clear rejection. There's advantages to being in both schools because basically you're getting a clear signal from the law school that yes or no you are or you're not getting in. But some schools will try to hedge their bets. Law schools really want to maximize the amount of students that get in, and they know that you're applying to many, many schools. So if you get admitted to their school and you get admitted to another school, one of those two schools is not going to have you. So law schools will admit a lot of the same people that are in the same categories. So if you got an LSAT score and a GPA score that's similar to other people, a lot of you are getting admitted, but not everybody's going to go there. So the law schools will admit a lot of people, but they know that some of them are not going to end up there. So what they do is they hang on to some wait lists. Once those folks that they really, really want to have in law school accept at other places, well, then they're going to start dipping into the people that are maybe on the lower end of this. This usually will happen at those reach schools or those schools that are kind of in the average that you may or may not get into. If you get a wait list, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you're going to be on ice for a while. Now, what that also potentially means is that you've been admitted somewhere else, maybe your safety school, or maybe you got into one of the schools that was similar, or maybe you got into that reach school and you still got a wait list. That actually happened to me. I got a wait list at a lower ranked school that I was kind of okay with going to, but then I got an acceptance at a school that I really did want to go to, that I actually eventually did go to. And so the wait list really was meaningless to me because once I got that admission, once I got that acceptance, there was no reason to remain on the wait list. So what you want to do is you want to decide once you get that wait list, how long do you want to wait? Are you really that interested in that school? If you don't get any other acceptances, if you're not accepted at all in the application process, well then hanging on to that wait list as long as possible is probably okay. But once you start getting other acceptances, you need to make your decision as soon as possible. There's a few reasons for that. One is that the seat deposits are going to come up really soon. So if you are accepted at a school and you're still trying to decide if you want to go there, in order to remain accepted, you have to put a seat deposit down. And that seat deposit is usually pretty steep. So if you're waiting around for that wait list and you are also wanting to be okay with this acceptance, you may be losing some money when that wait list actually comes due. That seat deposit is not refundable, and once you reject your acceptance and accept the wait list, then the money goes right out the window. The other reason why you also want to be making this decision early is that it's a good ethical thing to do. There are other students who are on the wait list. There are other people who are wanting to go into that school, and it may be the one that they really, really do want to get into, and maybe you're just kind of waiting around, hedging your bets. If you've already been admitted somewhere and it's generally the place that you want to go, just take the acceptance and don't wait around for the wait list to work out. It will free up some spots for other students who really do want to get there. So being able to send those signals early is a nice behavior. One caution that I would have for you is that if you're on a wait list, that means that you are on a wait list right up until the academic year starts. So your wait list will be there all the way through August. Now, sometimes the schools will just decide, all right, we're just going to purge our wait list. We're accepting no one off that. We've hit our benchmark for the year, and they'll send out a notice that says we're taking you off the wait list, and it'll be sometime in April or May. That usually happens once the seat deposits come in. But if by chance you stay on the wait list all the way through August, that means that sometime in August, potentially, you might get a letter that says you're accepted to this school. And that might completely change the way in which you think about where you're going to law school. And at that point, you're going to have to decide, are you willing to give up all those costs for the seat deposit? Are you willing to give up the possibility that you were already thinking about moving somewhere? You may have even moved at that point. And are you willing to pack up and then go to some other law school that you were only sort of thinking would happen? Again, these are all decisions that you're going to have to make, so you need to be thinking strategically about them. But hopefully you'll just get a clear acceptance somewhere and you won't have to worry about these things. Well, those are my tips and my considerations that you should have for going through the application process. As always, if you have questions, you can email me or meet me in office hours. Happy applying.